I followed closely the case this week with the young man who was arrested for leading police on that pursuit in Bellevue. There were three other teens not in custody because Renton police are still investigating that case. I did see that your department was able to convince the judge that he needed to be held. When you look at cases like this where teens are committing dangerous felony crimes, are you having a hard time both getting them the help that you think they need and also just protecting the public from them? And I may not be asking the question the right way, but I'm sort of curious about when you get a case like that, how do you view that case to protect the public and also to try to get this kid so you never have to see him again?
Right. Well, I think, it's kind of multifaceted, David, because every case is unique, every situation is unique, every child in our community has different challenges and obstacles to growing up and being successful. I think short term, yes, if there are young people committing dangerous acts like the one that we saw in Bellevue the other day, I think there does need to be an immediate timeout, right? Where we have to be able to put them in a place where we can have eyes on them and make sure that they're not going to go out and cause more harm. And then be able to gather information about what are those challenges, what are those obstacles from them being successful. And then but ultimately every one of these children, regardless of what they do, even if they commit murder, all right, in the state of Washington, that young person will eventually be back in our community. And so once they touch our system, we in the system have to be mindful of what are the interventions and combinations of things that we have available to us that can most likely result in the best outcome. And the thing is, there's no crystal ball that we can figure out exactly what that's going to be, right? And so what I try and do is, what I've said to people is, look, I went to law school and I have a law degree. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a researcher who has looked at these things, but I want to be a student of that. And so we try and take the best data, best research that we have. And the fact of the matter is that there is a lot of data, overwhelming data and research out there that says, just the sheer, if you just basically lock up children with nothing else, and then you let them back out into the community, that will make our communities less safe, right? And so it's not a one size fits all. I think at times, yes, we have to have an immediate response to make sure that the community's safe, but that can't be a long-term strategy to just lock kids up for long periods of time and then let them back into our communities, because we know, and the research shows that those people end up coming back into our communities and then committing crimes as adults and then just being, recycled through our system over and over again. And that's what people don't want. They don't want revolving doors, and that's exactly what happens.
When you have a situation where three of the teens involved in this pretty frightening situation for the person who got carjacked at gunpoint, not booked, cases not submitted to you right away because there are staffing issues in law enforcement and it takes time for them to fully investigate. Is there a concern or a message that sends to the public, though, that we're too lenient on some of these kids committing violent crimes?
Yeah, I think that could be a message, but I think then it's incumbent on those of us in the system and police and for us to work together and communicate with one voice, right? And then I think in that circumstance, well, let me first start off. We also have to understand that we live in a system where we believe in the Constitution. We understand that people are innocent until proven guilty. And so if you're going to deprive people of their freedom, you have to have evidence to back it up, and we need to have the facts, right? And sometimes those laws and the things that and the parameters that we have to work under don't fit really neatly in in the time frames that people are comfortable with, and that's just the reality of it. And in this situation, yes, the police had to respond and they had to make sure that the community was safe. And I guess this is the point I would make, is just because those other young kids didn't get booked into detention and nothing happened right away, that doesn't mean that nothing is gonna happen, right? At some point, we will still hopefully get the case from the Renton Police Department and be able to put a case together and bring those kids in and hopefully figure out what was the underlying situation in their lives that had them out there doing this to begin with no parental supervision, no support in the community to make sure that these kids are being put on the right track.
Yeah. I was surprised to see that the number of referrals for violent crimes involving juveniles that had been referred to over the last number of years were actually down.
Right.
Is that still trending for 2022 as we're now into 2023 though?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's a little complicated when you're dealing with juvenile data. When you're talking long term, or like let's say over the last 2 decades, consistently year to year, we've seen about a 20% reduction in police cases coming to our office from police, right? And that's not a perfect metric for crime rates because, you know, as you know, a lot of crimes go unreported, a lot of crimes go unsolved, but it's a pretty good measure of crime rates because it's what the police are investigating. And when they have a suspect, they send it to us, you know, for us to make a decision. And so over the last 2 decades, it has gone way down. But then what happened is when COVID happened, you know, 2021 was our lowest number of referrals by far, just because it, you know, it makes sense. Kids weren't in school, shopping malls weren't open, kids weren't able to get together in groups, and that's usually when kids get into trouble. And so our numbers were way down. And so 2022, once things started opening up, we are much higher than 2021, but 2022 is still lower than 2020, lower than 2019. And so we're still trending down, but 2022 was higher than 2021. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. I'm just trying to get a sense because, you know, the most egregious ones make the news, right? Those are the ones we hear about, but most of these cases don't make the news. So I want to make sure we're putting everything in proper perspective when we're talking about this.
I will be very clear though. Let me clarify this. Violent crime also has been trending down with the statistics. It hasn't been trending down as quickly. So for example, you know, over the last quarter century, we've seen about over 90% drop in referrals. However, violent crime has only dropped 60 some odd percent during that same period of time. But this is what's going on right now. We are seeing a increase in more serious crimes. So especially over the last, I would say 24 months. And that is not surprising as well, because we're seeing that in the adult system as well. And the reality is that these children who are committing these crimes, there are adults in their lives too. And, you know, the pandemic had its impact on all of us, and it puts a lot of stress on our whole society. And it's put, I'm sure, stress on the adults who are supposed to be watching these kids, supervising these kids. There are fewer opportunities for these kids to engage in the community, and unfortunately, we're dealing with the consequences of that right now.
You also, while you do have to prosecute against the kids if they've committed a crime like this, you also have to represent and help the victims who are trying to cope with a lot of this. What do victims tell you about being a victim of juvenile crime?
I think it's frustrating because you know, no one ever wants to be victimized, and what I hear from people who are victims of crime is that, you know, they want healing out of it. Sometimes they want answers as to why them, but first and foremost, they don't want this to happen to somebody else, right? And so our approach is to, in the best way that we can, to support victims. That's what we want to do. But we want to handle these cases in a way where we follow the research, follow the data to the best, you know, as we possibly can, you know, hope that we can handle the case in a way where the kid is supported and they're not coming back into the communities and reoffending. You know, one of the things that we're trying to do in juvenile court right now that I think can be controversial, because, you know, we are leaning into the diversion piece, right? And, you know, one of the programs that we are very bullish on is the Restorative Community Pathways program. And I think what is always lost when people talk about the restorative community pathways program is because they're always focused on the offender, right? But just as you mentioned, that program is designed to provide the same kind of services that they provide to the offender to the person who's been harmed. And so it's an opportunity for people who have been harmed to get their basic needs met, to get their restitution paid. If they need drug and alcohol support, they can do that. The program is designed to help them find housing. If they have food insecurity, they can get food as well. And so those are things that we were never able to provide in the court system, right? For people who've been victimized. And so in this program, we are able to provide those things. And that's sometimes something that gets lost, because I think that's a much more victim-centered approach. And it's a way to get people justice and accountability and support for being victims.
It's really helping both sides of it, is what you're saying then.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. All right, final question then. What is your biggest challenge you're facing right now to deal with these kids who are committing violent crimes, to make sure they're not back in your courtroom? What is the solution? What is succeeding for you?
I think our biggest challenge, in some ways, it could be the system itself, right? Like, you've been doing this a very long time, and we all understand that our system of justice is an adversarial process, right? And so, as I described to you, ultimately, these are children in our community, even though they're doing incredibly dangerous and harmful things. These are still children, right? And so as a community, I think our focus is how do we hold them accountable, but ultimately, how do we integrate them back into our community so they don't harm other people, right? And it can be terribly hard to do that in an adversarial process, right? Because, you know, as a community, we're trying to like come up with the best thing so that these young people can be successful and not harm people, but then we're actually like battling it out in court, and everyone is wanting one thing and another thing, and sometimes, like, I think it's difficult because you get these kids in court and the adults are all fighting, and then the kids getting the wrong message, right? It's kind of how, an example I have is like two parents who have differing perspectives on how to parent, and they send mixed messages to a kid. And, you know, we oftentimes hear like that's the worst thing that you can do for a kid, is to have parents who aren't on the same page. And I think sometimes that can be what our system does. And then these kids end up coming out of our system a little confused as to what's right or wrong. And so that, to me, is, you know, can be a challenge in what we're trying to do.
I can't think of anybody who has a harder job at the prosecutor's office than you, and the prosecutors working with you, really. I mean, you have critics everywhere, and you're also trying to, you know, do your best to help the victims and also try to make sure the kids are, you know, treated fairly and then don't end up back. So so that's that's not a job. So thank you.
I appreciate you saying that. I think sometimes when people do say like what makes being a juvenile prosecutor particularly hard is exactly what you said right there. You know, on the one hand, we're trying to support people who have been harmed, and we are very victim-centered, right? But at the same time, you know, you walk into court and the defendant sitting across the courtroom from you is this kid whose feet don't even touch the ground. And then you learn about their social history and the environment that they're growing up in, and sometimes, you know, it can be heartbreaking. And that's not to say like, you know, our focus is just like feeling bad for this kid and we don't want to hold them accountable. We do want to hold them accountable, but it's also recognizing that there are a lot of issues in our society and our community that make it very difficult for these young people. And ultimately, like I said, they're going to come back into our communities. And so how can we be responsible and respond in a way where we hold them accountable, but bring them back into a community where they are going to be successful and not commit more crimes?